September 1987. South African Mirage F1 fighters fly low level over southern Angola. Up above, a pair of MiG-23s, flown by Cuban pilots, are escorting Angolan helicopters. The plan is to zoom up and ambush the MiGs from below. But suddenly, the planes find themselves in a furball of a dogfight, with missiles flying left and right. This is a story of how Cuban pilots, the Cuban Air Force and Cuban military got entangled in a war against South African forces across the Atlantic Ocean. Not something you'd expect, but the history of the Cold War can get pretty weird. Secure data links have always been a mainstay of warfare. No one wants their data to leak out, which is why this video is sponsored by NordVPN. I personally use it as running a YouTube channel needs extra layer of security, but you may have other reasons. Maybe you just want access to your favorite streams or games when traveling abroad, or maybe you're stuck using the unsafe public Wi-Fi. NordVPN will encrypt your traffic from any device you're using, be it Android, Apple, Windows or Linux one, and it will connect you through one of NordVPN's 5200 servers. If you want, you can fine-tune the country where the server is based. NordVPN is the fastest VPN out there, confirmed by speed tests. You can even enable auto-connect and forget you're even using it. But best of all, Binko viewers can get a 2-year plan and 4 additional months with a huge discount. Go to nordvpn.com/Binkov and enter the code Binkov. That's it, then just enjoy your safe internet connection. Dogfights like the one mentioned were, of course, part of a much larger conflict, which is quite complex, but let's still try to sum it up to see how the Cuban planes even got to fight the South Africans. In World War I, Germany lost its colonies. South Africa then got control of Namibia, or what was then called Southwest Africa. Both that territory and the Portuguese-controlled Angola to the north struggled for independence over the decades. A myriad of nationalistic movements and political factions appeared and fought. Big powers like the US and the USSR used the area for their proxy war, fueling various sides. One of the strongest factions in Angola then got help from Cuba in the 1960s. There was a personal relationship between the leader of the Angolan faction and Che Guevara. Perhaps Cubans saw the Angolan struggle against the Portuguese as similar to their struggle against the oppressive Cuban government in the 1950s. Angola eventually got its independence from Portugal after a war, but only to slip into a civil war, with big superpowers further meddling in. Cuban forces remained involved, perhaps out of some sense of brotherhood with one of the factions, or perhaps encouraged by the USSR holding their back and supplying Angola with tons of weapons. South Africa, on the other hand, felt their hold on the Namibian territory destabilized. The border between South African-held Namibia and Angola was full of fighting, as Namibia's own pro-independence warriors often use Angola for a base of operations. South Africa raided Angolan territory periodically, clearing out those insurgent bases. South African Mirage fighter jets sometimes operated over Angola, and Cuban-piloted MiGs operated over the same area. But it wasn't until 1981 that the first confirmed contact in the air between the two happened. Two slightly different accounts of that November 6th battle exist. According to the South African side, a pair of MiG-21s flying under an Angolan flag but piloted by Cuban pilots and receiving communication input from the ground control in Spanish were flying a protective combat air patrol mission near the Angola-Namibia border. South African ground-based radars managed to track those MiGs, and a pair of South African Mirage F1 fighters were sent to intercept them. The Cuban side claims a pair of South African Mirage F1s were supporting a raid into Angola, and that the two MiG-21s were sent to intercept them. While ground control managed to point them in a direction so that they jumped the Mirages from behind, the Mirages started to evade, diving down. Suddenly, another pair of Mirage F1s appeared behind the MiGs. From then on, the two stories are similar. Major Rankin, flying one of those Mirages, can't get his missiles to lock onto the MiGs. Getting close enough, he eventually shoots down one MiG, the wingman's plane, with his cannon. The other MiG manages to escape. A year later, another pair of Mirage F1s were escorting a recon plane over southern Angola. A pair of MiG-21s were sent to intercept, but once again it was the South Africans which managed to first intercept the MiGs, dictating the pace of the battle. Two French-made Matra Magic missiles were fired at one MiG, but the first missile missed completely, while the second missile allegedly detonated while still some distance away from the MiG, damaging it but not taking it down. That MiG managed to flee, but according to the South Africans, its companion was not so lucky. After a brief dogfight, it got shot down by cannon fire. Then they allege even the first MiG suffered some additional damage. As it went to land, it realized the missile damaged its landing gear. Thus it had to perform a belly landing, which it did successfully, but that damaged the plane even further. Just how the belly landing story started is unknown, as the Cuban side mentions no missiles fired in the dogfight, only that Major Rankin fired his gun at one of the MiG-21s, damaging it, but that both sides then disengaged and that both MiGs landed normally. Years earlier, Cubans sent tens of thousands of military personnel, sometimes including their own equipment. When the Soviets delivered the first MiG-21s to Angola in late 1975, it was the Cubans who helped establish a functioning air force, as Angolans had no experience with such hardware nor air combat. Those MiGs were mostly the MF variants, though Soviets also sent some older variants, and Cubans themselves sent some of their own MiGs, which likely flew under the Angolan flag. The MF variant was devised in 1970. It got a true radar, a better engine, a built-in cannon, and the ability to use the R-60 air-to-air missile. Previously, the MiG-21 variants used a pair of K-13 missiles and either no gun, a gun in an external pod, or for the early variants, an older gun with a 3 times slower rate of fire. The Sapphire-21 radar was still quite small and inadequate for the 1980s. In practice, fighter-sized targets could be detected only from 8 miles away, and a good lock was achieved only from 4 miles away. Perhaps even worse was the nose geometry of the MiG-21. Due to the inlet, the search cone was quite narrow, so the radar could often lose track of the enemy if it went outside the cone in a close fight. The K-13 missile, also known as the R-3S, was nearly obsolete by then, and was only capable of locking onto the hot rears of enemy planes, which meant MiGs had to first maneuver behind their enemies. While Soviet MiGs did also sometimes use the radar-guided R-3R, it was not known if those missiles were exported to Angola and Cuba. The R-60 was a newer infrared-guided missile, but it was a tiny weapon with a small warhead. It was quite maneuverable, but given its 1970s heritage, it still wasn't an all-aspect missile. And given the limited hardpoints on the MiG-21, usually only 2 or at most 4 were carried. South African air forces started their war ops back in the 1960s. They used the French-made Mirage 3 against their pro-independence Namibian opponents. Mirage fighter variants were delivered between 1962 and 1964. Trainer variants were delivered in 1969, and newer multi-role variants were delivered from 1965 to 1972. While the Mirage 3s did not have a history of confirmed air-to-air combat with MiGs, they did get used a lot. It is not known if any were shot down with SAMs, though there was at least one occasion in 1981 when an Angolan SA-7 man-pad missile hit a Mirage 3, which, while damaged, managed to get back home and land safely. But Mirage 3s were already showing their age in the 1970s. It was a small fighter with poor radar, poor range and poor missiles, basically not really superior to the MiG-21. Indeed, back in the 1960s and early 1970s, those Mirages used Sidewinder B missiles. That was an obsolete model which showed horrible performance in Vietnam and was in the US quickly superseded by better variants. In a sense, the Soviet-supplied K-13 was roughly analogous to the South African Sidewinders. South Africa planned to get their hands on a new French offering, the Mirage F1, which was developed in the late 1960s and entered service with the French in the early 1970s. Hoping to strengthen its defense industry, South Africa was actually negotiating licensed production of those F1s back home, with negotiations with France reaching back to 1971. The license deal fell through as the UN arms embargo against South Africa due to its apartheid policy came to effect in 1977. But the South African Air Force did get its hands on French-built Mirages F1. Several dozen were delivered from 1975 until the embargo kicked in. As early as 1978, the Mirage F1s were used over Angola, both as fighter escorts and strike aircraft. The bad performance of the Mirage's missiles was to be somewhat remedied by a domestically developed missile. The V3 missile development started in 1971 and a small number were in use by 1975. The French-built Mirage F1 were modified to use the missile even before they left France. Said missile was accompanied by the French Matra Magic missile, which was also a short-range infrared missile. But neither of those missiles could lock onto planes from the frontal hemisphere. And in the 1980s, due to the arms embargo, South Africa could not procure the all-aspect Matra Magic 2 missile. South Africa did procure some Matra R530 missiles earlier, but the fighter's radar could not guide the missiles properly when combat happened at low level due to ground clutter, which was basically always over Angola. In 1984, the USSR sent new fighters to the Cuban Air Force contingent fighting in Angola, the MiG-23 ML, and that was actually quite an advanced variant. The Cubans also shipped some of their own MiG-23s to Angola a bit later. While the initial variant entered service with the Soviets back in the 1970s, it took half a decade to perfect the MiG-23. The ML finally had it all: a decent radar with somewhat useful look-down capability, a powerful engine, and numerous maneuverability improvements. It would usually carry 2 big R-24 semi-active radar-guided missiles and 4 R-60M short-range missiles. The new variant of the latter was now even able to lock onto enemy planes from the frontal hemisphere, though at a very short range. Against the MiG-23, even the Mirage F1 didn't seem so powerful. While the Mirage did have a supposedly decent radar, low-altitude missions did not allow for good utilization of that radar, and South Africa did not possess the truly capable Matra R530F missile. The South African raids into Angola got bolder and became constant over the years, as they supported the UNITA faction, fighting it out in the Angolan Civil War. The faction controlling the government was the MPLA, supported by Cuba and the USSR. Eventually, the Angolan government became strong enough to try to crush UNITA forces in the south. The Cuban military helped directly on the battlefield as well. Finally, in February 1987, a flight of 3 Mirage F1s ambushed a pair of MiG-23s on patrol. Several V-3B missiles were fired, but none hit as they were fired from too far away and lost energy too early. The exact reason for such usage is not known, but maybe the South African pilots were too afraid to approach the MiGs close, as MiGs were armed with more missiles. Another encounter was recorded on September 10, 1987. 2 MiG-23s, flown by Cuban pilots at low level, got ambushed by a pair of Mirage F1s. Even though they managed to outmaneuver them and reached a favorable firing position behind them, their Magic 550 missiles either missed or detonated sufficiently far away that they didn't damage the MiGs. Possibly not wanting to risk their lives for something that's not their fight, the Cuban pilots simply capitalized on the MiG-23's better acceleration and escaped the area. But then on September 27th, a fight with a much more serious outcome did finally occur. Mirage F1s were flying over southern Angola. South African ground control radars spotted what should have been a nice target: a group of Angolan helicopters being escorted by a pair of MiG-23s. The MiGs were flying fairly high up. The plan was then to vector in those Mirages silently using data from the ground radars. The Mirages were to come below the MiGs, climb upwards to combat distance and ambush them, then possibly even wreak havoc on the helicopters afterwards. Not wanting to alert the MiGs, the Mirages flew with their radars turned off, but the ground radars were quite far away. The image of the battlefield and plane's position were not precise, so as the Mirages climbed up and faced the MiGs, they realized they did not come up behind the MiGs, but almost in front of them. The coordinates they received were obviously wrong. Suddenly the MiGs turned towards them. The ambushee became the ambushed. The following is an account of Arthur Piercy, one of the Mirage pilots in that dogfight. He claimed that the two pairs of planes were rushing head-on to each other at a very short distance. In fact, it was allegedly so close that there were no missiles fired in that first pass. No side managed to get missiles ready to fire in such a short time span before the planes passed each other. Piercy further claimed he got a clear view of a MiG which passed just 300 feet below him. Both pairs of planes got in a turn and found themselves in a situation where they once again went head-on one against the other. One of the MiGs, piloted by Alberto Ley Rivas, fired 2 missiles. Sources differ on whether those were R-60M or R-24, but given the very short distance described, it's plausible those were the small R-60s. The other MiG fired a confirmed R-60 toward the other Mirage F1, piloted by Carlo Gaggiano. Apparently, the Mirages did not get to fire their cannons as they were busy evading missiles. The missile going after Gaggiano missed, but one of the 2 missiles going after Piercy did not. As Piercy braked into the missile's path as thought, the missile overshot a little, but still detonated behind the plane, while passing it by. Both Mirage pilots scrambled for their lives and attempted to flee, not wanting to engage the MiGs further, since one of them was damaged to an unknown degree. For an unknown reason, the MiGs did not pursue them further. On the way back to the base, it became clear the Mirage started to leak both fuel and hydraulic liquid. The landing gear was damaged, though Piercy did not know that. The plane's drag parachute housing was also damaged. Planes like the Mirage F1 deploy parachutes as they land to shorten the required landing run. Lacking fuel, Piercy was redirected to land at the forward base. He went to land his damaged plane, but as he touched down he realized that applying the brakes did nothing. The brakes were not working. He was not able to come to a stop before the end of the runway. The plane went over a sandpit at the end of the runway and then even went through a security fence. Piercy claims that at a certain moment he just heard a sudden bang. For some reason, his ejection seat went off and he was hurled into the air. Apparently, he fainted. When he came to, lying on the ground, he realized his seat did not detach, which is not supposed to happen. But the parachute did deploy. Piercy was in pain and could not move his legs. He survived, but he was paralyzed for life. The Mirage airframe itself sustained enough damage to be written off. While there were other contacts during the war, this was the only one where a Mirage F1 was lost due to air combat. For example, in 1988, another encounter had a Mirage fire both a missile and its gun into a MiG-23, but without success. It's plausible that some Cuban pilots were rarely willing to actually risk their lives for the Angolan cause and pursue the South African planes. Though, as the USSR did not want to supply external fuel tanks, the MiGs were also often low on fuel. Mirage F1s also suffered some SAM-fire over the years. In the 1980s, 2 were damaged by missile detonation from an Angolan SA-3 system, but both managed to fly back to safety. Though in 1988, one Mirage F1 was shot down by an SA-13 during a low-level bomb raid. No MiG-23 were lost in air combat over Angola. MiG-23s, just like Mirage F1s, were actually more used for strike missions. Allegedly, Angolan MiG-21s and 23s performed over 1,000 strike sorties within a 3-month period in 1987 and 1988. South Africans became more wary of using Mirages over Angola. There are alleged accounts of South African soldiers claiming that the South African Air Force basically avoided MiG-23s and that the offensive operations would pause when those MiGs were in the air. But the whole war soon changed. The USSR was falling apart and lost interest in the proxy war. Pressure was mounting on South Africa through further sanctions due to the apartheid policy. Peace talks brokered by the US and the USSR got started. Cuba, wary of now decades of involvement in Angola, proclaimed victory after a big ground battle at Quito Canavale. While the battle was a tactical draw, it was only after that battle that the South Africa relented at the peace talks and offered to leave Namibian territory if Cuba left. As the USSR stopped its help, Cuba agreed to leave Angola. In 1989, Namibia became independent. So those particular wars ended, but of course Africa still saw fighting. Even after the other countries left, the Angolan civil war lasted over a decade, finally ending in 2002. The faction that Cuba supported eventually won. Decades later, Arthur Piercy eventually tracked down Alberto Leiravas, the man who he fought against, a Cuban Air Force officer and a South African Air Force officer flying Soviet and French jets respectively, fighting over Angola. The two men talked and there was no grudge involved. Piercy had planned to fly a trip around the world and invited Leiravas to fly with him. Mr. Rivas said yes, though it seems Mr. Piercy never got to finish the plane that was to make that flight. One last thing for our fans. Remember our videos on the Soviet air defense systems and missiles? Well, those were written by our colleague Balázs Molnár. And guess what? He now has a YouTube channel of his own. The next episode of the Soviet SAM series is already available there, and more will come soon. So if you're interested in more of similar content, do check out the link below our video and check out his YouTube channel. He will also cover historical military operations, like the strike on the Osirak nuclear reactor. He's planning a myth-busting series on many topics, like SR-71, F-104 and so on. If you like capability comparison videos, or videos on evolution of different generations of planes and their weapons, or even videos about technical backgrounds of various military systems, well, then he may be your guy. He tries to use exact values and data in his videos and goes into important details. So give him a try. And Molny, thanks for contributing to Binkov as well. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.